Gravity Terminology Call, where we'll be covering topics in racism, toxic stress, and protective factors over the course of the next hour and a half. We will formally begin our meeting at about 3 to 5 minutes after the top of the hour, just to allow folks to transition and join us. And welcome again. My name is Sarah. If you don't know me, I'm the Director of Terminology here.
Is Gravity going to be at the annual research meeting this year? Or?
I'm going to try to get there.
I'll
We're
be
not
there
presenting,
too.
though. Yeah, it's just too rich of a why.
Experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good reason why we do our work experience. So I try to get when I can. Welcome everybody. You know, I say we start at either 4:03 or 4:05. So I think these meetings we start at 4:03. So I'm going to get going. We have a lot to cover today, which is you know, the kind of typical for this stage in our work where we're rapidly identifying instruments and diagnostic concepts across our domains, and we're addressing 3 domains at this time. So again, welcome everybody. This is the new domain development wing of the Gravity Terminology public call, and we can get ready to get kicked off. Next slide. We thank you for everyone for joining. Anyone who comes, we start with being muted, but we usually have a pretty robust conversation over the course of our time. All calls are recorded, and we put them on the Confluence so anyone can look at them after the fact. And everyone's encouraged to participate in the conversation using the Zoom chat. Please send chats to everybody. Not necessarily typically, we do have, I'm going to try to time box our conversation today just so we can get through some content, knowing we'll revisit again in 2 weeks. So looking forward to having the meeting today and covering the content that we have to address. Next slide. The next slide is our antitrust practices slide. We are a standards development initiative, and so we're required to comply with 8 antitrust practices. So all participants, including participants in the call, have the responsibility to comply fully with federal and state antitrust laws. And we apply the compliance to antitrust principles pretty broadly. And so it means not only just intending to avoid antitrust violations, but also ensuring you don't do anything that might be construed as an antitrust violation. This is just, again, core to our work in standards development and part of every single meeting that we have in our work. Next slide. Brief announcements, including, you know, we're trying to integrate the topics that are being addressed in the technical call, and this time I have the right topic. Brief, very, very brief terminology overview. And again, we're leading with protective factors, instruments, and concepts this time. It's kind of a pseudo protective factors kickoff because we haven't delved into it very deeply yet. We'll then go into instruments and concepts and toxic stress because we did not get through addressing them last meeting. We had a really wonderful meeting last meeting, but we centered on the topics of the instruments to identify racism and didn't get to the bottom of our agenda. And then we'll close out with emerging diagnostic concepts to address ethnic and racial discrimination. I am going to try to cover each of the different domains within 20-minute increments, just for the sake of, again, familiarizing ourselves with new content, because the SMEs are doing a lot of work, understanding that we will come back in 2 weeks. And so if there's things that are uncertain or, you know, we need to unpack more, we are going nowhere. We have months more to meet with each other. But I do want to make sure that we at least familiarize all of you with the topics and decisions that are happening in the SME meetings on Tuesdays. And then we'll close with homework. Next slide. Next slide. So again, the terminology work stream, Thursdays, Eastern Standard Time, 4 to 5:30 Eastern Standard Time. And then new domains is this series every other week. And then we work on enhancing existing domain terminology in the alternating call. The technical work stream is bi-weekly Wednesdays, 1 to 2 Eastern Standard Time. And the great thing is that I falsely announced the topic before, but we're really excited on April 2nd to dive into best practices for employing a standardized approach to screening for, documenting, and coding social risk factors and needs. This is discussing the Gravity authored brief, best practices for validating and documenting social diagnoses, that's put in the chat. Again, just thank you for all the members and community partners who helped with that brief, and really excited. I know I can't wait to be there next Wednesday, so looking forward to that. And again, Sarah Bahal, amazing Sarah B, is putting all of the different links in the chat. So feel free, and please do read the brief ahead of the meeting, and then know that the brief is located in our resources for implementation section on the Confluence if you want to find it outside of the meeting. Our next Affinity meeting is not until May 29th. So we're not going to worry about that for some time, but this is what you can expect over the course of the next like couple weeks here for our 2 different work streams, our primary terminology and tech. Next slide. Any questions on the brief announcements? All right, next slide. Gravity project, and again, we're in a process of examining our vision statements. We're doing strategic sessions right now with our steering committee, our dedicated members, grateful for that. The current vision as it stands is the Gravity project is striving to create a world where health and social care organizations readily share the information needed to effectively meet the social needs of individuals, advance health equity, and improve health outcomes in communities by using standard terminology and technology. And again, we are working on this with our steering committee, and grateful for their support. And we've included and elevated the perspectives that have been raised in this call to the members as well. Next slide. Lexicon. I've been using this every single time in this series because we are finally addressing protective factors. One of the things I might start doing, just because there's so much change in language, is showing concepts here that are equivalent. Like, because we use the term social drivers of health, social determinants of health, others use the term social drivers of health. They are conceptually equivalent. Protective factors is pretty stable. It's a topic that we're addressing in our domain work. We here and in our work align with meanings and misunderstandings of lexicon for the healthcare systems, authored by Laura Gottlieb and Hugh Alderwick, but social risks are often used interchangeably with a couple different terms: health-related social needs or non-medical needs, just all saying that even though we might name them different things, we're pointing to the same thing, and just there's a lot of language in flux these days. So just those concepts are equivalent. And I have a table crosswalk that I've made for other purposes that I'm going to be sharing with the steering committee and maybe bringing back to these meetings in the future, just for clarity, so that we all can at least ground on what on the words we're using and how they can be used interchangeably in some instances. Next slide. Our amazing members, so grateful for all of the members that put in effort into, like prioritizing and creating the roadmap and helping us with strategy and guiding us with wisdom. Again, our members are a crucial part of our work, and we're incredibly grateful for all they do. We are lucky to have a few new members coming into the picture over the course of the next months, and you'll see them soon on this slide as well. Next slide. Our 2025 roadmap, I'm not going to go into it too much because we've now presented it a few different times. The one thing that we'll be settling on over the course of the next weeks is the topic and environment that we are addressing in the fall. Again, it's our members who prioritize all of our different domains and use cases, and that should be determined very shortly. And so when we come back in 2 weeks, we should be able to name that last domain that we'll be addressing in fall 2025. In addition, we're working on all of the enhancements work, again, in that enhancement cycle. Our technical team is working deeply on the 2.3 updates and planning for STU 3.0. we just got mentioned to start thinking about the CMS Connectathon, and the Implementation Affinity Group has a new cadence quarterly. But again, we're always trying to lean into that. And the focus of the Implementation Affinity Group this year is really trying to think about outcomes and return on investment, given that we are moving on and evolving in our standards development and standards implementation. Next slide. Again, I said this now repeatedly, all work within Gravity is prioritized for the roadmap by Gravity governance members. This includes every new domain and use case, and it's truly a collective representative of the voted upon priorities of the body and not just one entity, right? We are consensus in our roadmap choices, just as we are in our work within the work streams. Next slide. And I'm consistently making sure that we ground ourselves in our data principles. We do this every meeting. They are improving personal health outcomes, improving population health equity, ensuring personal control, designing appropriate solutions, ensuring accountability, and preventing, reducing, and remediating harm. I do not know if anyone's gone, if everyone on this call has gone to the Confluence to look at the data use principles, but there's a lot more in-depth content there that's particularly relevant right now that one can find if one does go. Next slide. These are the questions we're asking over the course of the next hour. Again, I'm going to try to represent a lot of content, trying to ground ourselves in about 20 minutes per domain. But what we're doing, our base core questions that we have in terminology and new domain work, again, we bust this out over in enhancements, is identifying standardized instruments used to identify the domain. This is a large focus of our meeting today, identifying the core diagnoses that need to be stated. For the first time, we have some diagnoses that we're going to be presenting today. What are the goals related to the risk or condition? Those are yet to be determined by our subject matter experts. And then interventions. We're starting to talk about interventions, but again, more to come there. Next slide. We're about, like, our cadences, we're probably about like 3 weeks ahead of the public call in the SME group, where we're thinking about things, and then they get through the hopper and then come into the public call. So we're kind of right where we expect ourselves to be roadmap wise. So we are still in the concept identification phase, have one more meeting, and then we'll be going into a long 1.5 long period of end-to-end review, closing with our vote at the end of May. Next slide. All right, any questions on overview, roadmap, work plan? Okay, so I'm going to try to keep myself honest and present the next topics, 20 minutes per section. We'll see. So starting at 4:15, let's see how we can do. Next slide. I am very excited to do a very high level overview of protective factors. I want to note that the information you see here is largely representative of the wisdom of many federal partners who are not able to be here today. But I do want to hold up their wisdom over the course of the next slides, and you'll see it woven throughout. So if we go to the next slide. There are a couple themes we're hearing within protective factors. Again, this is the first time we've been talking about them directly because we've been addressing a lot of content over the course of the last weeks. We've been exploring really the landscape of protective factors and strengths-based assessment in our subject matter expert meetings, and we can see really 2 roles for protective factors concepts within our work. Again, we'll be talking very deeply about what protective factors are across the next slides and also in 2 weeks' time. But we're seeing and emerging within toxic stress the role that protective factors have as the focused and evidence-based interventions known to mitigate toxic stress physiology. And we're going to, again, that's an intervention concept. So we're going to talk more about that over the course of the next weeks and months. Within this area, protective factors as the focus, we really are trying to lean into the strengths-based approach and assets we assess and foster to promote well-being, holistic understanding, and capacity. Knowing that we often borrow concepts across different domains, but in this instance, we're addressing toxic stress and therefore addressing protective factors as interventions. But we're also just heavily leaning into protective factors in their own right. So we're broadly introducing protective factors in their own right today as a primary assessed concept. And then we actually have a wonderful presentation in 2 weeks on the role of protective factors in Indigenous health. And looking forward to that. They couldn't join us today, our subject matter experts who are leading that work, but they'll be back in 2 weeks. Next slide. So the role of protective factors in whole person care. So protective factors and strengths-based assessment are the focus of family-based and trauma-informed work. It's essentially what we do to foster and facilitate better outcomes. You can see protective factors concepts woven throughout the practice and policies of U.S. Health and Human Services agencies, the Administration for Children and Families, SAMHSA, et cetera. And again, there's going to be plenty of models and examples of that over the course of the next slides. And it's especially critical, protective factors are especially critical, and strengths-based assessment, especially critical in the work of pediatrics, family practice, social work, nursing, and trauma-informed care. I often speak to the fact that if we have a patient problem list, there is a mirrored strength list somewhere in there that we have yet to fully define and name and uphold as critical. And I see my friends from AFP here. Hello, Alicia. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to be detailing, again, trying to honor all of our federal friends and their wisdom over the course of the next slides, and talking about the American Academy of Pediatrics as well. Within SAMHSA, protective factor approaches are core to the substance use prevention, trauma-informed, and mental health approaches of SAMHSA. There's many, many briefs that talk about the role of protective factors. There's a lovely brief called Focus on Prevention, which is strategies and programs to prevent substance use. It really details the critical nature of fostering protective factors and strengths in adolescents, specifically to prevent towards prevention of substance use disorder. There's individual factors like temperament, social coping, belief. There's family factors like belonging and parental connection. And then there's environmental and community factors as well. And these themes we're going to be playing across all of our different domains. All of our different protective factor slides over the course of the next slides, and in the instruments that we're going to be raising to you all. So there's individual factors, family factors, and environmental factors. These factors will eventually be pulled into like the equivalent of diagnostic concepts in time. We have some of them through prior domains, but this is the general approach from SAMHSA. Next slide. And again, I'm trying to keep myself to I'm doing, yeah. Very honored and glad to highlight the American Academy of Pediatrics Bright Futures Protective Factor assessments and criticalities. So Bright Futures was authored by two dear friends who were based in Burlington, Vermont, here where I live, who have now retired. Edited by Judy Shaw and Joe Hagan, who I'm sure Alicia knows as well. But the statement regarding protective factors in American Academy of Pediatrics materials and Bright Futures is the AAP recommends promoting and assessing family strengths during each well child care visit, along with screening for optimal child development. And there's these themes of strengths like nurturing and attachment, parental resilience, social and community connection, caregiver knowledge of child development, and social emotional competence. All of these themes are themes that we're working with families to assess, foster, elevate, support in our work to help families and children be well. Next slide. I gave Sarah so many things to put in links here. And again, I'm doing a high level concept. Our friends will be back. Some of our subject matter experts will be back in 2 weeks to talk more. I cannot speak to, and again, this is going to make me a little emotional, but I cannot speak to protective factors without talking about our amazing colleagues in Administration of Children, Youth, and Families, which ACF weaves protective factor approaches through every single program. In 2022, they convened like a massive literature review, which is the kind of the foundation of protective factors approaches in ACF. And it was so fundamental. All protective factor approaches were woven into every critical and core ACF program. This is a quote from the first link here, which is focusing on protective factors offers a way to track child and adolescent development by increasing resilience in the short term and contributing to the development of skills, personal characteristics, knowledge, relationships, and opportunities that offset risk exposure and contribute to improved well-being and positive outcomes in the long term. And you can see the models within ACF and the National Center for Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention detailed below, right? So again, you have those community level protective factors, positive school environment, community environment, and economic opportunities, relationship and interpersonal concepts, parenting competency, positive peers, and caring adults. I think it's really important to note that within children, protective factors of having non-parental significant adults is really important. We'll see that in our screening instruments. And then individual level protective factors as well, again, all aiming towards social and emotional well-being. You can see the same themes happening over on the right side, which is another Administration of Children, Youth, and Families model. The critical thing here, and this is partly representing economic opportunities, is concrete supports being a protective factor, but again, parental resilience, nurturing and attachment, emotional competence, knowledge of child development, and social connections, all being core concepts in child development. Just making sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. I think we're doing good. Okay, next slide. And then lastly, I just wanted to make sure that lastly, again, just for the overview of protective factor concepts, understanding that this is a pseudo kickoff, right? Because we haven't talked about protective factors yet. And the themes I'm talking about will likely become diagnostic concepts or condition concepts or findings the same way risk concepts in food insecurity became food insecurity, right? So more to come on the concepts and themes and how they become terminology. But our final, one of the really beautiful final resource is really a protective factor approach to community wellness, not just individual wellness. I had some lovely conversations again with friends in the ecosystem, just one-on-one conversations to prep me for this. And there's this concept of surviving versus thriving, and aiming toward thriving being the goal, both for individual wellness and community wellness. In 2022, there was a massive cross-agency initiative to create the Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience, which is all based on principles of protective factors at the community level, and ensuring that protective factor approaches are woven in, again, to every single program, aiming towards resilience, equity, and wellness. 35 different agencies across the federal government gathered to create the paper, which we'll put on the Confluence, and Sarah's put in the chat, which is the concepts, the community level protective factors are the thriving natural world, basic needs for health and safety met, humane housing, meaningful work and wealth, lifelong learning, reliable transportation, and belonging and civic muscle. And belonging and civic muscle in a community being so critical, but it's actually the center and core thing without which nothing else can happen. We know this is the way community action works. We know this is like how communities gather together to foster wellness, and this lovely, it's called the Vital Conditions Framework, and it was created and stewarded by a foundation called the Ripple Foundation, who then helped the federal government in the Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience. It's a beautiful read. So what we've covered over the last slides is consistent focuses on strength-based approaches and protective factors as interventions toward wellness across many different agencies in government. SAMHSA, ACF, ACL has approaches as well. The criticality of assessing strengths and promoting protective factors in the American Academy of Pediatrics approaches, including every single well visit, And again, I've said this before, but I follow the Bright Futures guidelines, as does my colleague Alicia. Every single visit, I'm assessing strengths, everyone, and fostering strengths and working to connect families to make sure that their strengths develop and toward the betterment and health of the child and the whole family unit. So I hope that, again, humbly trying to fill in for all kinds of wonderful experts who are not able to be here today. Very glad that in 2 weeks we'll be coming back with friends from the National Indian Health Board talking about the role of protective factors in Indigenous health. Very, very grateful for that. And now I hope we're high enough level that we can start to see how these themes play out into some of the instruments that were approved by the SMEs over the next slides. And again, my apologies for keeping a steady clip here because we do have so much content to get through. Ask me any question if you want as we go along. I'm not seeing any hands, but just know where I'm here. And we're doing great on time. Next slide. All right. So having covered the criticality of strengths-based approaches and protective factors work across individual, family, and community wellness, we're now going to start socializing assessment instruments that highlight these core protective factor elements within individuals. Next slide. We talked about I think we will talk about, I don't even think we got to it last week, but there are 2 different ways of assessing both adverse childhood experiences and protective factors. There are ways of assessing childhood experiences within adults. So asking adults, think about your childhood. Did you experience X? And there's ways of assessing communities, parents, children in real time, in the moment. We're going to be very careful when we talk about both protective factor instruments and adverse and toxic stress instruments to clearly say when one is which and one is the other. The next instruments are adult look-back instruments. And so they're assessing childhood experiences to understand adult wellness. And then we'll be looking into in the moment protective factor instruments toward the goal of fostering wellness and harm prevention in future iterations. Next slide. The 2 kind of core instruments that emerged out of our own literature review and that were consistently supported and elevated by our subject matter experts are 2 adult look-back instruments on protective factors. And we're calling it protective factors because even in the instrument, it's called positive childhood experiences, which you can hear is kind of a correlate of adverse childhood experiences or benevolent childhood experiences. So these 2 are really core critical instruments. The positive childhood experience scale is going to be deployed in the brief risk surveillance syndrome instrument, like deploying this year as a correlate and balance to the ACEs instrument. So it's a very widely used instrument, and we're going to go over the themes and questions over the next slides. Next slide. All right, so this is the positive childhood experiences scale. Again, an adult look back instrument. And I want to see if you can feel those themes that we saw in the protective factor presentation within these questions, right? So the preface is the next questions refer to the time period before you were 18. Now looking back, then these are the questions. For how much of your childhood, and sorry, this makes me emotional because I do adolescent trauma work, so I have feelings about this. For how much of your childhood was there an adult in your household who made you feel safe and protected? And we can hear that again. There's that household, parental connection and support and safety concept. And then the next question is, how often did you feel that you belonged at your high school? And that is that school belonging, community belonging theme. How often did you feel supported by your friends? Right? And that is that interpersonal, social, emotional competence belonging concept. How often were there at least 2 adults other than your parents who took a genuine interest in you? And this is, the coach, the school guidance counselor, again, critical to have non-parental adults that are there and you feel seen and heard by? How often did you feel you were able to talk to your family about your feelings? Again, social emotional competence and family connection. How often did you enjoy participating in your community's traditions? Community connection, community belonging. We'll hear a lot more about that again in 2 weeks when we have our friends from the National Indian Health Board come back. And how often do you feel like your family stood by you during difficult times, right? So that's, again, safety, nurturing, connection. I want to say personally, and I didn't go too much into this, if not for at least 2 adults other than my parents, I would not be here today. It is literally my school guidance counselor. I'm going to say her name, Susie Halleck Baligan. Thank you so much, Susie Halleck, for seeing me and fostering me, wrapping around me, supporting me, teaching me. Like, I am literally here today because of her, and I wrote her ahead of this meeting saying that. Next slide. So this is the PCE, and then again, these same themes and are displayed in the BCE scale. So when you were growing up during your first 18 years of life, did you have at least one caregiver with whom you felt safe, that caregiver, direct person, one good friend, interpersonal relationships with peers, beliefs that gave you comfort? That's a critical one, right? So that's like faith. It's kind of represented in the community traditions concept in PCE, but not quite. School belonging, teacher who cared about you. That's a specific teacher reference to the non-parental adult. Good neighbors. And then was there an adult, not a parent or caregiver, who could provide you with support or advice? That calls it out, not with a teacher. Opportunities to have a good time. Did you like yourself or feel comfortable with yourself? And did you have a predictable home routine, like regular meals and a regular bedtime? And this is about self-regulation and patterns. Another thing I really love about the Bright Futures instrument is the beginning first question for every person who's old enough to answer is, what do you like most about yourself? So 11-year-old kids, 12-year-old kids, 13-year-old kids have to name something. And if they don't, it's a really important conversation, right? And so that, again, this is like woven into everything we do with child health and parental support and adolescent health within primary care practices. Okay, so over the last, it was literally 20 minutes. Wow. I hope I didn't like disrupt questions. I'm seeing the chat. I think that I hear lots of understanding so far, but so over the last 20 minutes, we have reviewed the highest level concept of what protective factors are and how they're operationalized across primary care practices and strengths-based assessment, the professions of social work and nursing, SAMHSA, ACF, ACL, and how they even can apply to community level concepts. We've also elevated these 2 core adult look back instruments that are really used to understand like adults in like real time based on their childhood experiences. Again, not just negative adverse childhood experiences, but positive ones and how they balance to create wellness. Any questions on, again, this positive, hi Lucy, positive protective factors kickoff before we go further? Hi. Ask away.
This is, wait a second. This is wonderful, Sarah. I am going to go where angels fear to tread.
Okay.
To just say, if you go back a few slides, there's the individual, the family.
Oh
did you
yeah,
say
yeah,
the community or the environment. Political policy
I know.
shapes the environment, and it is impossible for parents and children to escape the risks that the political environment may surround them with. And therefore, is it conceivable, it may not be evidence-based, but is it conceivable to consider understanding, advocating, changing policy, in addition to all of this focus on people?
Mhm.
Could
Yes.
that be within our scope of work, or is it just not, or not? There was one slide that had something called political muscle
Yeah.
that was just beginning to point where I'm thinking, and certainly if I look at my own background with respect to all those questions, politics was always present. It was explicit. So where does that fit here?
Lucy, that's a very good question. And it's partly why we brushed upon, like, we all have responsibilities in communities. So if we think about this is a great slide to land on. This is not a healthcare centered slide.
Right.
This is a community centered slide.
It's a policy
Yeah. Yeah. So
centered slide
yeah,
to me.
yeah, that too. And it was crafted but by government. But so there, when I think about this work, and then when we did our kickoff, we had the World Health Organization framework for conceptual action on the social determinants of health, right?
Mm-hmm.
That fundamentally states that every single person has a responsibility for advocating for the policies that create well individuals and well communities within the healthcare system. So I don't know how and like healthcare coverage is policy. Allocation of resources within value-based care for community wellness, community health needs assessments. That's all policy responding to the charges of changes. And yeah, I don't think we cannot, right, respond to it. And I would love, we'll bring back that leaving space for community action slide at the end that we had, because I feel like it was difficult for me to get these slides together today, given what's happening in my hometown, like trying to make sure the Fair Housing Organization just lost funding is still funded. And, so
Right.
I'd love to make sure that we bring that back and think about what next together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I just thought of, if you proceed through the slides, if you would ask an adult, before you were 18, did you ever take political action about anything? I mean, we could word it differently, but if the answer to that was yes, what do you mean by political action? What did you do? How did it make you feel? Did it make you feel stronger, more powerful? Did it change your relationship? I mean, there's just a whole nother slide of questions that could follow from that. And again, I don't know what the evidence base is for asking that question. I would just, okay.
I don't know if it would be a protective factor, but it is certainly something you've raised continuously as like voting as like, a social determinant of health and political investment. There's a lot of literature on that. Our friends over at Health Begins, my friend Rishi has a lot of perspectives on that as well. And it's certainly in here, belonging and civic muscle, right? Like
Okay, so we come back to this
yeah,
eventually.
you're
good.
barking up the right tree, Janice.
Thank you.
And then hopefully we can move.
Yeah, I just want to say on that regard, I think it was like civic engagement. Like the first
Yeah.
time I did was 1967, and we all had our own autonomy, the class, and worked with the president. And like 3 of us got answers back. It was very interesting, right? I asked the Vietnam War to end to President Johnson. Anyway, on that note, when we were going through the slides, go a couple forward. I was just thinking of the differences within communities, and like I had a very stoic family, right? And so if we could go 2 slides forward. Yeah. this one, where there are two adults and whatever, like, would you talk to them? And so another thing I know within some of the communities I, partner with a lot, I often hear what stays in the home, what happens in the home stays in the home. The reality is, as adults, they realize they really did not have that opportunity because they didn't feel comfortable. They had been taught that, right? To whatever happens in the home. I think it was more prevalent when in the 60s and 70s. I mean, that's just an assumption and earlier, whereas now people are open a little bit more about it, but it's definitely important to reflect on. And, another thing that's interesting is this, some of them may be very low, like never or little of the time, and then other ones could be all the time, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Thank you.
I love it. Thank you, Janice. Any other thoughts before it's going to be interesting because we haven't covered our adverse child experiences instruments yet, or theme. We've talked about it. Makai did the kickoff. But we're about to go into those next, and you'll see a very interesting, like, inverse. Yes, Jonathan, before we go in?
I'm going to be fast about this, right? But what I want to say to the comments that were just made is I think that the trigger points for where these decisions are being made is going to change, right? So instead of like writing to the president like back in like 1960, 1970, like going to like your local civic engagement leaders is going to be like a more direct line to it, because like you can actually get to them quicker and the information's going so quickly. Does that make sense?
It does. That's why governance of
Yep.
data is community level. That's why so says this Vermonter who loves her town meeting.
Well,
Yes.
and because when I think about it, I think of public education and I think of public health as core pillars of any society. And so the ability for them to have like high level terminology and taxonomy that ties into whatever their technical infrastructure is how they're going to be able to glean the data points to like talk about where they need to move the lever for protective forces and all these other things that they need to implement for their specific community.
Heard. Love it, Jonathan. And then, hi, Mark.
Hello.
Again, I'm hoping to keep us going. We went over our 20 minutes and we have a lot to cover. So dear Mark, take us out.
Thank you. Well, this is probably going to open things up, but I'm just going to put it out there, and you're going to use your wisdom and the community's wisdom to figure out where the right place is to put it. I think this is a carryover question from the last meeting when we
Okay.
had to end. I am struggling with trying to figure out how to categorize some of the things we're looking at, and where to look at the synergies and the sort of intersectionality of some of these things. So we're looking at racism. The various forms of discrimination could be treated separately and standardized separately. There could be things in common about them that it might be useful to developing standards to understand the commonalities first, or to address or to discuss the commonalities first before separating them out. This has certainly been a factor in much of my civil rights litigation, to see how what are the similarities, what are the differences, and to use those to our advantage. The reason I'm raising this as a placeholder issue for me now is because we haven't done the same thing with protective factors. You could say that the protective factors too ought to be differentiated by race, gender, various things, but we're sort of talking about them collectively. I'm sure there's a good reason for that,
Okay.
but I was going to wait till the end when we got to the racism piece, and it just struck me that maybe the place to just plant the question without getting into an answer is here when we're talking about the things sort of in general across the board, rather than splitting them out as on the strength side. Thank you. I hope that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. And I'm going to say, I'm going to package it for a second and say, Mark, we are talking about intersectionality within our subject matter expert meetings because we have to, 100%. And we actually are going to eventually bring back the whole discrimination framework that AMA, Kenyetta, Kartik made that will help, was part of the ICD presentation. We did you know, we're fundamentally having to address intersectionality when we're talking about discrimination because you can't not. But just know that we are honoring the many and the one consistently in our subject matter expert meetings. And we certainly have other domains in discrimination scoped for future work. It's on the Gravity Roadmap. Members are voting on it. It's coming down the pike, but we look forward to coming back in 2 weeks and talking through the framework. And I think I want to hold up that when it's required, it is 100% fully within our lens, right? And it's partly why we're bringing back and understanding cultural perspectives and nuances are partly why we're centering National Indian Health Board in 2 weeks, because of how critical cultural connectedness is and belonging within the Indigenous population. So we just didn't want to not center it. So we're doing the best we can to scope out and scope in and ensure we're being inclusive and intersectional as we do our work.
Right. And I forgot to mention a concrete example from the last meeting. It was slide 29, the racism screening assessment.
Oh, yes.
Um,
Oh, yeah. And all the
where-
answers. Yeah.
Where the
yeah.
recommended options and the answer actually get into everything.
No, I know. Yes. 100%. 100%.
Okay. So
Yes,
there's if you need some grounding, there's a place.
exactly. Yes. And that's part. Yes. 100%. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And again, we did raise coming soon the whole AMA discrimination framework so we can talk about it holistically as well. Okay. All right. Trying to make sure we cover concepts. And again, my apologies. These same slides will be here. These concepts will be here in 2 weeks again. So I'm just trying to make sure I don't get so far. I don't want to leave the public behind as the SMEs are continuing to forge ahead. So I'm trying to get content in front of you all. All right, so now I'm going to try to segue into toxic stress and at risk for toxic stress physiology concepts, really leaning into adverse childhood experiences. And you'll be hearing some of these concepts mirrored, some of the approaches mirrored through protective factors. Next slide. Okay. We did not get a chance to get to this last time, which is partly why I'm trying to keep pacing. Again, my apologies. So these are the toxic stress screening assessment instruments that we'll be talking about over the course of the next slides. There are so many, I am not able to read them word by word. They are on the master list, and so we'll detail them in detail. You can review the questions. And they were presented in part when Mackay presented the kickoff for toxic stress physiology a month or so ago. But I want to address the categories and themes because it will set us up for talking about the diagnoses, which are new. Next slide. Again, over the course of the next slides, you'll see 2 types of methods for adverse childhood experience assessment. One is the classic initial framing of asking the adult to reflect on childhood experiences toward the goal of understanding possible toxic stress physiology. The other is asking the child or parent toward the goal of preventing it, right? And Mackay went deeply into that in the presentation a month ago. We're trying to be really clear about when these 2 different approaches are used, but the critical thing is the themes and categories that the instruments are assessing. The core ones are constant. Right. And there's some differences in supplemental information that they do in the ACEs Aware Pearls instruments, but just noting that at base, the themes are constant. Next slide. There's instruments to assess children and families. This is really spearheaded by the work of ACEs Aware and the Pearls instruments and the California use case that Mackay presented. There's child level instruments, teen parent caregiver reports, and teen self-reports. Once an individual is 12 or above, sometimes 11, it is best practice to do assessment of the child level. The same thing happens in Bright Futures, depression screening, the CRAFT screen for, substance use. Once they hit a certain age, we start trying to center assessment with the individual. And then there are the instruments to assess adults, right? So there is the correlate ACEs Aware assessment instrument for adults, and then the fundamental seminal behavior risk factor surveillance syndrome adverse childhood experiences questionnaire. I'm just trying to see questions. Okay. Okay. Yes, I think we just
Sarah,
need to
you
bring
can
back
read
the-
all this later. It's
Okay,
just
okay, I'm
following
just
up on
trying
my,
to
it's,
not.
yeah, this
I
is
know,
not to
but-
interrupt you
I
whatsoever.
know, but the framework for collective action and the hoop conceptual framework, we'll bring it back next time so that we can like level set and have moments there because I think it's important, right? Okay, next slide. The core categories that we talked about, themes and protective factors, parental connection, concepts of resilience, community connection, interpersonal belonging, school belonging, structural supports, right? Social muscle and capital. We talked about those from a protective factor perspective. There are core 10 categories in adverse child experiences that are, and if our amazing, brilliant friend, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was here, she would be able to go off. She was unable to be here today. But there's a ton of literature on the Confluence available, but the core base concepts that have the highest level of evidence of being associated with toxic stress physiology are in these buckets. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of the child, physical neglect and emotional neglect, and household challenges, including parental mental illness, witnessing intimate partner violence, parental separation or divorce, parental incarceration, and substance use, misuse, or dependence. I want to note that these are challenging things to discuss. And so it's, I'm already getting emotional. It's like, again, I do this work with children. I specialize in adolescent trauma. So it's a little bit challenging. I want to hold up that the incarceration concept is an accountability to the incarceration domain that we did last fall. Our subject matter experts in Kwesi, hello, were very clear that we couldn't do incarceration status well without understanding the effect on children in the household. And so part of focusing on ACEs and toxic stress was weaving in and ensuring that we included considerations for incarceration and families in our spring work. So again, there's a lot of questions and instruments coming over the next slides. We do not have time to read every question. Every question is going to be posted in the master lists. But I will try to highlight the themes again, these core themes, so that we all can see them in common across the instruments because they are in common. Next slide. So this is the parental in the moment assessment of the child. And you can see the theme of having a child with a parent and caregiver who went to jail or prison. You have the perception that your child felt unsupported, unloved, or unprotected. You have parental or caregiver experiences with mental health issues. You have child experiences of being insulted, humiliated, or put down. We have biological parent or caregiver experiences with substance use disorders. We have lacking appropriate care by a caregiver, neglect. We have witnessing violence in the home. We have being physically harmed. We have being sexually abused. And we have disruption in the relationship status of the child's primary caregivers. All incredibly difficult topics. Again, those themes, we remember them from the slide prior, those core categories. These core categories are again replicated across each of the other instruments in the set. And we'll go more into that in the next slides. But another really critical thing to note is that the Pearls instrument has an additional supplement to bring to light other significant experiences. Again, not as, the core 10 have been researched for decades, right? But they bring to light these other core 7, these other really critical 7 concepts as part of a supplementary screener. And this includes witnessing violence in the neighborhood, experiencing discrimination. Again, this ties into our other domains. problems with structural supports like housing and food, being separated from a parent or caregiver due to foster care or immigration, serious physical illnesses, and losing a parent or caregiver from them passing away. Incredibly complex and difficult content, but the boon is that if you, based on the literature of ACEs Aware, if you identify these things early and intervene, the literature shows from their extensive work that you actually can prevent, possibly prevent toxic stress physiology in these critical windows of child development. And so that is the muscle behind the California ACEs Aware approach. Next slide. I am not going to repeat the questions on the PEARLS instrument because they really are the PEARLS instruments for the teen and the teen self-report, because they are the same categories, same additional questions. The only thing that changes is when you have a teen, the child has additional experiences in the supplemental questions. Because the child themselves can be detained, arrested, or incarcerated. And it also has an additional question on experienced intimate partner violence for the child. Again, so part 1, the core 10 constant. Part 2, the supplement, essentially constant, except for because they're older, adding in questions of child being detained, arrested, or incarcerated, and child experiencing intimate partner violence. Next slide. Mark, I'm going to hold space for that until Nadine is back. I don't know what you, Nadine and Makai will be back in 2 weeks. And I'm wondering, can we hold that for them? I just want to honor your question. Okay. If we can capture it, Sarah, and we'll address it on Tuesday with our SMEs and then come back. Next slide. So this is the core experiences of the core categories of adverse child experiences in the ACEs Aware instrument for an adult look back. Again, you can see those 10 core themes. Again, that we saw on the first slide represented here as well, but the only supplemental question is, do you believe that these experiences affected your health? Again, we have neglect, divorce, losing parents to divorce, abandonment of death, mental health concerns in the parent, substance use disorders, physical abuse, incarceration, emotional abuse, witnessing violence, feeling emotionally neglected, and then sexual abuse as well. Lucy?
Does experience in war come in here anywhere?
There are, the supplemental questions, if we go back, one slide. In the US instance, you can see war or terrorism being seen, heard, or been a victim of violence in your neighborhood is a supplemental question for the PEARLS instruments. We have been, so yes. And in World Health Organization applications of adverse childhood experiences, we see that theme as well. In the US implementations, the CDC ACEs Aware approach is so fundamental, we haven't thought it necessary to add an additional World Health Organization instrument in, but we are exploring that. It does go deeper into different types of displacement, refugee elements, different types of wartime experiences, but generally it's in the supplement.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I have a quick question. When does the supplement given? Like I was, trying to say, for instance, on the left side, it's regarding a relationship change, but on the right side, it's a little bit clear, you know, like maybe somebody's died or something.
So they do, it's often administered all at the same time,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. But you know, again, Makai and Nadine, when they come back, they can go more deeply into that, but it's just like, for instance, in my clinic, we do supplemental, we do it all. Like we don't just do one part and then later another part. We do part 1 and part 2 in the same instance.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think I'm okay. I think the last one is that was very sweet, Asha. My friend Asha is helping me along with little arrows, and I appreciate her very, very much. And Sarah B, you're there too. So this is the fundamental instrument in the behavior risk factor surveillance syndrome system. I mean, I do want to note that this is the behavior risk factor surveillance system is the national longitudinal assessment of health that the Protective Childhood Experiences instrument is going to be deployed in 2025, as far as we know from our friends at the CDC. So they have been assessing adverse childhood experiences for some time. Starting now, they will be assessing positive childhood experiences as well. So again, you can see the core 10 categories. So again, this is adult look back now. We had our assessing the child, assessing the adolescent, parent, caregiver, and assessing the adolescent themselves. And now we have, then we had the ACEs aware adult look back, and now we have the behavior risk factor surveillance syndrome adult look back. We have the adolescent, we have the caregiver, mental health, substance use disorder, incarceration, parental separation, witnessing violence, being physically abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused, and whether or not you had an adult who helped you feel safe and protected, and whether there was an adult in your household who tried to make sure all your basic needs were met. Right, slight twist on the questions in the adult look back, but again, those same core 10 categories and themes. I think, so next slide, I think that this is, so those, we did not get to them last meeting, but again, so those are the core so far approved instruments that assess adverse child experiences toward understanding the risk of toxic stress physiology and the body, right? And the child instruments really are toward the goal of trying to aim toward prevention. And the adult instruments are aiming toward understanding. And again, I have to state that we in my clinic, we do an adult look back once for every adult, just to understand how to better meet people and take care of them. We're now going to go into the diagnoses. Again, thanks for bearing with me. Again, the idea is to ensure that the breadth of content the subject matter experts are creating on our Tuesday sessions are visible and transparent to all of you. So these are the toxic stress diagnoses we have so far, based again on the themes of the prior instruments and aiming toward telling critical stories, because that's what diagnoses are meant to do, right? Tell critical stories. Next slide. Although our SMEs are still in the process of exploring diagnostic needs, there might be more to come. What they have decided on, it relates to the ability to convey risk for the toxic stress physiologic response, right? Risk for carrying the adverse child experiences in the body. I'm just trying to see. Absolutely, Lucy, they do, right? And I know, not unlike our intimate partner violence domain, you know, we, some of the domains that we address are so critical that it had, I mean, you were in our strategic session, that it's really behooves us to talk about privacy, consent, and data segmentation when we address them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay.
Yeah. We actually have a initiative in partnership we'll be talking about toward that end in the steering committee on Monday, coming soon. Sorry, Lucy's a member, so thank you for your service. All right, so the next slides, next
Thank
slide.
you for your leadership.
Oh, buddy.
It's remarkable. I think everyone here would agree with that. Goodbye.
Thank you, very sweet. So the toxic stress diagnostic concepts our subject matter experts have arrived at are, again, are concepts that convey the risk of the toxic stress physiologic response. Very mission driven, incredibly evidence-based, right? The three concepts are in progress, but are right now high risk for toxic stress physiology, intermediate risk for toxic stress physiology, and low risk for toxic stress physiology. We would not be able to say high, intermediate, or low unless we were able to say as evidenced by what, right? So luckily, and gratefully to the expertise of the ACEs Aware Initiative and the extensive literature regarding adverse child experiences, we will be able to say as evidenced by the ACEs algorithm coming on the next slides. We didn't want to present these concepts without reminding you of that algorithm. It was presented by Mackay a month ago, right? We'll work on the wording of the definition, but each of these have a definition in the literature that can ground the assessment, and there is implementation materials to support this. There are toolkits, there are desk references, there are provider support. It's highly implementable. So unlike some domains where there's like not sufficient literature, you know, or resources to implement the terminology that we're aiming for, you know, in this instance, we actually have, you know, a deployment machine that is ready for the diagnoses to come. Yes, Mark?
Sorry, I'm realizing I'm maybe confused about what risk means here. And the uses that I've had done over my life, my professional work, it has been sort of a risk of a future event happening.
Oh, yeah.
And, but it seems like here, toxic stress there may be a risk of a future event, but it may have already occurred. Which
Yeah,
means
so-
it's not a risk question. It's actually what's the effect of a past event? Anyway, the word risk is I'm puzzling over that, and maybe just indicating that is sufficient. I don't need to take more time if you can help me out there. Thank you.
I think the algorithms might help, and then I do, because they're coming on the next slides, and I want to note that we the presentation Mackay gave when we did the ACEs kickoff went deeply into what we mean when we say risk, right? And why it's about physiologic, like changing in the telomeres of the body, right? And not just risk for a future event. Right. And so the SMEs have been really leaning deep into that like for this domain particular, leaning into that physiologic response and that critical early childhood 0 to 5 window. And then the adolescent window as well. And again, Mackay, Dr. Burke-Harris do a far better job than I ever could. And it was the ACEs, the toxic stress kickoff is the litany of lit there. And you can see on the next slides the algorithm.
Thank you. I'll go back and look at that. But what you just said makes me wonder if, like, would any of this change if we said, instead of high risk for toxic stress, we said high presence of toxic stress physiology?
Well, that's it. I'm
And
going
I'll
to put
just-
that for Dr. Burke-Harris. I think she would have a lot to say about that because there's no specific indicator, and so you have to. It's like there's no way to measure it in the body, right? At yet, and so this becomes a proxy. Again, highly supported by the literature, but I want to note that we have materials on the Confluence to support this. The Mackay's press kickoff on a month ago did a really good job, and I just want to see if we can keep moving through unless someone has something else to say. Lucy or Monique?
Go ahead, Monique.
I was just going to quickly share. I can see where Mark's coming from, and the notion of risk having a different meaning here, and wondered about the word probability. But I know that these are things we can discuss with the SME, Sarah.
It's important, excuse me, it's important that I'll offer as Sarah moves through the material, allowing yourself a moment to unanchor from an experience that is familiar to you, to anchor into how the instrument may create a space where conversations happen. So although we may have an experience that we can anchor to in how we hear language, it's important to consider that in the moment when the individual who is in the role of the patient and the provider and or the community is experiencing this question, their experiences and how they share those experiences is nuanced in so much as how the provider, as Sarah's offering to everybody, has an experience and a professional way that they bring that opportunity versus how our own lived experience or living experience of how these instruments may show us in the present moment. Hoping that makes sense to everybody, because your questions are really helpful. And if we can kind of untether, it helps us stay present with where we can go, and then we can unpack as we continue.
We have slides coming up. Sorry. Lucy?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a question again when Mackie was presenting about age. And so in the definitions to be done, could those definitions be explicit about what age we're talking about when we are applying or investigating or introducing these concepts? Thank you.
That's a really good question. Lucy, age comes in actually in the next slides, because the algorithm is different for children and adults. So I think that's really important. We'll bring it back to the SMEs on Tuesday.
Great.
All right, next slide. So the reason why we're using the word risk for now is because this is the algorithm. We can explore it and unpack it and see, I'll definitely bring the idea of probability or nuances to risk back to the SMEs on Tuesday. But for right now, just grounding ourselves in the as evidenced by algorithm, we have for the child again in the moment, a score of 0 is not no risk, it's just low risk. And it even has like interventions that you do. So the whole thing, the clinical desk, like the implementation support, it's all built in by design. Intermediate risk is a score of 1 to 3. And then you can see there's another level, because we were talking actually, I think, Janice, I'm trying to remember, but sometimes you have a lot of something and it's just one score and you already have effects of it. Like you had a really significant traumatic experience, experience of sexual abuse, and you have existing anxiety and trauma and panic and PTSD regarding that. So if there's presence of an associated health condition, and again, this is all in the implementation materials, it affects the score, right? So intermediate score is a score of 1 to 3 on the instrument without health conditions, but you move into high risk if you have associated health conditions that drive up the risk and the requirements of intervention. So this is the pediatric instrument, again, with individuals towards preventing the toxic stress physiology. And then again, this is to show the as evidenced by, because we wouldn't want to do low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk without showing that we have evidence to assign those algorithms. Janice, hi. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just, it's interesting about this is like children who were, or anybody for that matter, even as an adult, but we're not measuring adults, we're measuring adults at child experiences. If they were food insecure, what like a risk could be, they may maybe they're at higher risk of being overweight later, right? You know, just to be honest, I was homeless years ago and I was food insecure at that time. And it took me literally over a decade of living, you know, being housed to feel comfortable sharing my food. I still shared my food, but every time I would be like worried I wouldn't have enough, even though I have enough money, right? So you realize how much that can impact children.
Trauma, we carry it in the body, Janice. It's like we have memory. It's hard. Yeah, I mean, I think this is what we know is that it takes years, and if we're able to. Well, so thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I just want, you know, it's just compounded like you see here. If they've had a score of 4 or more, which a high percent of adults today have experienced 4 or more high risk
When
ACEs.
even this is like where it becomes like, you know, I hate to say like a proxy for structural discrimination, right? So, I mean, in like whether it's socioeconomic concerns or whether it's, you know, like racism and discrimination, like, or it doesn't, you know, there are certain communities who bear a burden of this more than others. And so this becomes part of like equity and disparity addressing, more on that. And, you know, perspectives on ACEs scores and utility in 2 weeks when we have our friends from the National Indian Health Board come back and talk about interventions and community efforts in Indigenous populations, especially in response to just like such a high prevalence of high ACEs score that it ceases to be implementable within communities. So more on that in 2 weeks. Okay. Next slide is the adult version, which is slightly different. Because the adults have moved through the, you know, the kind of formative years for toxic stress physiology, that 0 to 5. Again, Mackay going deep into that in his presentation, and Dr. Burke Harris as well. Low risk becomes 0 to 3 without associated health conditions. Intermediate is a score of 1 to 3 with associated health conditions. And high risk is a score of 4 or above with or without associated health conditions. Again, the purpose of these algorithms to show that if we feel at this time, our subject matter experts feel that low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk diagnoses are the critical concepts, we can say as evidenced by this, right? So we can clearly state that there's an evidentiary base and there's an implementation toolkit to support that. Whoa. This is tough stuff, friends. Okay. We have 11 more minutes in our meeting. We've covered high-level concepts of protective factors, 2 instruments that assess for protective factors, adult look back, instruments that assess for toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences, diagnoses that ensue from those instruments. And we have 1 new slide in topics and discrimination. I think we can get to it, but I wanted to see how people are doing. Do we feel like any questions? I don't want to open up another domain until I feel how you all are doing.
How are you doing?
Okay. I'm going to go for a walk after this meeting. I appreciate it. Okay.
This is an amazing space that you open, Sarah. And we can all see you and hear you. And this is not a casual conversation for you.
No. It is interesting how like we have developed a place of safety for each other over the course of 6 years, you know, where emotions are able to be felt appropriately and authentically as we're talking about difficult things. Okay. In order to honor the extensive work of the subject matter experts, I'm going to try to just, again, there's only one new slide of content. Let's move on. Okay, next slide. Again, lots of new content. So this was important to just have it all be transparent to you so that when you see the master lists, you can reflect and go in deeper. We'll have ongoing conversations on the things. And again, I have lots of pins held. We have new diagnostic concepts within racism that we want to present to you all after discussing the instruments last meeting. And we're going to spend the last minutes closing on that, and that will close our meeting for the day. Next slide. We addressed the instruments in racism and discrimination, again, noting it covered comprehensive topics in discrimination, Mark, and so understood. And we are significantly speaking to intersectionality in our subject matter expert meetings. Our subject matter experts at this time have come to consensus on a couple really critical topics that are our diagnostic concepts, really trying to lean into the capacity to tell critical stories. One is the evaluation of the concept and support and elevation of the concept as submitted to the ICD-10 Coordination and Maintenance Committee meeting a year ago, which is targeted discrimination due to racism and victim of racism being the equivalent in SNOMED. We really leaned deeply into what we mean when we say racism over the course of many, many meetings. The specific definition of racism will come back shortly, but the foundational definitions are generally inclusive of discrimination based on race and ethnicity. And in the World Health Organization, materials and frameworks, concepts of colorism are raised there. And so the SMEs felt comfortable grounding in trying to name racism as the cause and driver, leaning into the SNOMED concept of victim of racism to represent ethnic, racial, and discrimination based on colorism, and targeted discrimination due to racism. Again, this is really just evaluating and then supporting the concept that AMA submitted a year ago with the definition to come. We want to note that by deeply diving into the way racism is experienced, a whole set of other concepts are being explored at this time. Our subject matter experts felt it was really critical to name discrimination's effect on trust within the health system. So in addition to the victim of racism and target of discrimination due to racism concept, they have elevated experience of discrimination generally affecting healthcare trust. Mark, this in part speaks to the intersectionality element because sometimes it's hard to just pick one, but also clearly elevating and by requirement elevating how racism can affect healthcare trust. Again, noting the wording might change over the course of the next weeks, but if we're really thinking about the critical role of healthcare terminology, these felt like important things to say, good stories to tell. What we are working on now, and again, knowing the wording might change, is we're trying to explore, like subject matter experts are exploring how distinct experience of racism, including internalized racism, manifest in health and health outcomes. There's a lot to be explored here. That's kind of our next area of work. But these are the first two terms or two areas of terms that our subject matter experts have come up with in diagnostic concepts for the domain of racism. I thank all of you for sitting with this. And anyone have any thoughts? This is again our final concept of the meeting. Really just incredibly grateful to our subject matter experts for walking through this, their wisdom and care.
I would just ask for the subject matter experts whether affecting healthcare trust encompasses trust in the social care services that the social determinants of health work point to.
That makes sense, Lucy. We might need to add additional concepts. We actually were telling the story about how discrimination affects access to social services, especially right now. So that seems important to highlight. Thank you. Okay.
Go
Thank you.
take a walk.
I'm gonna go take a walk. Yeah. All right. I'm just gonna just thank you, WISE community and friends, for sitting with us over the course of this hour and a half. I hope you see the care our subject matter experts are taking in this very critical work at this very tender time. You can review everything you've seen today on the master list that will get posted to the Confluence tomorrow. We will hold your questions and bring them back to the subject matter experts and see you here in 2 weeks' time. And I hope you all have a lovely evening, and thank you all for your care. We will see you soon.
Thank you, Sarah.